The McAlvany Weekly Commentary covering monetary, economic, and geopolitical news events.
For me, my future hope and prayer for Zimbabwe is complete and utter reconciliation. No matter what anybody does to me, I'm not going to allow the actions of someone else to determine how I live my life. My mission is reconciliation to all, to whoever, with the love of Jesus, going as he would have gone. And that love is what breaks down fear.
Now here are Kevin Orrick and David McAlvany.
Welcome to the McAlvany Weekly Commentary. I'm Kevin Orrick along with David McAlvany. David, we just got back from a conference in Coeur d'Alene, and the things you talked about were common to us, but uncommon to the people you were talking to. You know, it's common to us for you to talk about the legacy of debt that's being left to our children and some of the injustices that are occurring here in the country. But your second talk talked about not a top-down solution, because the government's not doing anything to really solve these problems. They're just making them greater, and the injustices are occurring to a greater degree as well. But what you talked about in the second talk was about the solution that you can bring about in your family, the legacy of how you react and what you do as an individual.
It is this contrast between macro-level problems and micro-level solutions. And when you look at how we arrived at many of our macro-level problems today, social, moral, political, certainly in the financial realm, when we talk specifically of debt, you're talking about the aggregation of individual choices. It was the micro-level compromises that ultimately created something that is now the quote-unquote elephant in the room, the big issue, which is going to be very difficult to address in a top-down fashion. What I would suggest is that many of these macro-level issues do, in fact, have micro-level solutions if we'll look at, just as there's been a negative aggregation of individual choices, you can look at individual choices from the other vantage point, too, and say, okay, well, what can I put in motion of a positive nature that in aggregate over the next 6 months, 12 months, 24 years, whatever it may be, is something that changes the tide.
Well, and you've written a book called Intentional Families, talking about just that, not just bringing intention to your own life, but bringing it to your kids' life and going back and forgiving parental errors of your own parents and having them do the same type of thing. Redemption and forgiveness seem to play into actually the core of legacy.
They really do. And when you look at family dynamics and what ultimately destroys a family legacy, often you find broken hearts, not broken bank accounts, which are the compromise of that future family legacy. And so what I would suggest, here in the next few weeks, you'll be able to pre-order the book on Amazon, but there is this issue of forgiveness and redemption. Not long ago, I had the opportunity to interview two men, Ben Freeth and Craig Deal, and both of these men live in Zimbabwe, and they've been a part of the land seizure program starting in the year 2000, which for both of these men cost them their livelihoods, their farms, and everything else. And the reality is that in the last several years, they have had to manage more than just physical resources because, quite frankly, in terms of legacy, they've had what they had planned and built for years, even for decades, ripped away from them.
Well, and even one of their father-in-laws died from the injuries that were sustained when they were taking the land.
That's exactly right. So what you end up with is a circumstance where, in the absence of managing physical resources, they still exist in the context of crisis. They still exist in the context of pressure because nothing has changed in terms of Mugabe's land program. And perhaps someday they will rebuild that country on different foundations. But in the interim, they have continued to create a legacy for their children where they have managed both the emotional life of their family, the intellectual life of their family, towards forgiveness and redemption. And I think it's an absolutely fascinating story. Ben, just days before I had time to spend with him and talk about these issues, was before U.S. Congress and shared some of his ideas specifically about the injustices in the Mugabe regime, but also what was necessary in terms of bringing healing to the land.
So he said there was a choice between being angry over injustice or ultimately choosing to forgive and move on.
I guess what I want to suggest as we move to that interview is that, again, there are many solutions at a micro level which we can move towards positively and proactively, which ultimately do have a macro level impact. And I'd just like for you to entertain that idea that both at the level of financial resources, but also when it comes to managing what goes through your heart and mind in response to crisis, it is still a question of resource management.
Or, Dave, you can choose to have a seed of bitterness over injustice. And, it's easy to do that. You can choose to make the best of it. Churchill talked about how many times can you fail and then still get up. And it seems to me like these men have chosen to get up.
Craig, Deal, Ben Freeth, thank you for joining me just to discuss some of the things relating to not only your background, your personal story, but also the background and story of the country you hail from, Zimbabwe. One of the greatest modern stories, and perhaps historically one of the greatest as well, stories of monetary and economic collapse. And you've been on both sides of it when things were strong, and you still live there. So would love to get some insight from you. From either of you, beginning sort of with the history, Rhodesia became Zimbabwe, and this is many decades ago. What was Rhodesia? What was Zimbabwe in its early years? What did it become?
Rhodesia was a country that in 1890, there was essentially very little there. There was a small population of perhaps up to about 500,000 people. There were no roads, there were no schools, there was no written language, there was no wheel. And so it was a country that had not yet entered the modern age in any way at all. And within a very short period of time, after colonization took place in 1890, the railways came in, the roads came in, agriculture came in, title deeds were brought into place, the law courts were built, a police force was established, and things moved forward actually incredibly quickly in Zimbabwe, or Rhodesia as it was called then, Southern Rhodesia, to the extent that I believe that there are very few countries on earth that developed from where it was to where it then got to in such a short period of time. The 1960s brought the winds of change, where countries became independent, so-called independent in Africa. But unfortunately, the Cold War was running at the time, and those countries became independent on the basis that the Marxists came in with huge influence and unfortunately destabilized those countries to the extent that property rights were destroyed, and very few of those countries actually became success stories. In fact, most of them went into absolute failure. And so Rhodesia decided to resist that move that was taking place throughout Africa and decided to try and go for a transition that would take longer, whereby individuals who had a certain level of education or who had a certain amount of property or business had more of a vote than people that did not. And obviously, from a racial perspective, white people had more of a vote at that stage than black people did, generally speaking. And that, of course, caused a lot of friction. And the Chinese came in force, the Russians came in force and supplied tens of thousands of AK-47s and lots of training, and a full-scale war developed in the country until finally in 1980, independence did come. But the president at that time made a speech to say that we would essentially beat the swords into plowshares, and he asked the white population to stay on. And so a large number of white farmers and businessmen and industrialists stayed on into independence, and the country muddled on. In fact, by the 90s, actually was doing extremely well and was growing very rapidly. We went through a period in the 80s when about 20,000 people were massacred in the south of the country by the 5th Brigade, which was a North Korean-trained brigade. But generally speaking, the country was going forward, and certainly by the 90s, although it was one-party state, the country was growing dramatically economically, and we had an educated population. We had a population that had the best health care in Africa. It was a country that I think most people were extremely pleased to live in. And then we got to the year 1999. A movement was developed. The one-party state suddenly was challenged, and the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions leader, Morgan Tsvangirai, formed a political party, and we had elections coming up in June of the year 2000. And before that, Mugabe tried to put together a new constitution that would entrench his power. And there was a referendum, and the people rejected him as a leader that would have more power. And they rejected in that constitution the fact that land could be taken for free from anyone that the party wanted to take it from. Obviously, it was marked out for taking land from the white farmers. And the people actually rejected that in the referendum. And within 2 weeks of that referendum result, the land invasions began, and all hell was let loose, literally, in the land.
So from the year 2000 to the present, it's been a very different Zimbabwe. Craig, you talked earlier this week about how rich the country is in natural resources. And I mean, both of you have a background in agriculture and farming. You've managed thousands of acres, and this was not just a little business, but a booming business, providing fruits and vegetables and products to South Africa, to Europe, a massive export trade, helpful to the country. Clearly, what happened 99, 2000 to the present as land was literally ripped from your grasp and other people like you.
Yeah, I think Ben's covered the history and the political side of it. I just can comment on us personally. I was born in the era when Zimbabwe was reputed to be the fastest growing economy on the planet. And then to be thrust into the fastest collapsing economy on the planet in one lifetime is quite a thing. But as with 4,000 other farmers, we lost our land through this program, land reform program. But we decided that we made a conscious decision as a family that we were going to stay in the country, that we weren't going to allow ourselves to get bitter. And through the help of the Lord, we were able to get to a place of total and absolute forgiveness, which has given us a platform to stay in the country and continue to serve Africa. And with the talents that I've been given as a farmer, me and my family, we made that conscious sacrifice and decision to stay where most of my peers left the country. But we made a conscious decision to stay and serve Africa for the rest of my life. That's my life's ambition now, is to serve Africa and teach small-scale farmers around Africa with the talents that I've got, and teach them what we call a way of farming that can break the yoke of poverty and break the yoke of dependency that hangs over a lot of Africa.
So we have a massive economic impact from a set of ideas. If it was Marxist in its origins, perhaps it morphed into something different. Maybe it was just Marxism on steroids.
I think it was Marxism in name, but it was never really pure Marxism. It was a means by which to, first of all, gain power, and secondly, to remain in power at whatever cost to the people of the country.
Yeah, that magic piece in the Marxist equation where, you start with hard power and ultimately move to a utopian state where everyone benevolently steps down and the people take care of each other. Somehow, the dictator never wants to step down.
And then that'll never work as long as man is selfish. The selfishness of man gets in the way of communism, Marxism. And so if you unwrap every sin on the planet, it comes back to selfishness. And so cooperative Marxism could never work with the selfishness of man in place.
Craig, you've hit on something that's fairly profound. I mean, just to restate, for quite a long time, you had a farm. And this isn't sort of the, I had a farm in Africa. From Itzhak Deinson, you did have a farm in Africa, a beautiful farm, very productive. So did you, Ben. This is a fascinating turn of events where you go from having a livelihood, real wealth. This is real stuff. This is not paper assets, and the joy of working the land. My question relates to how you've chosen to forgive, because it seems to me that when people lose $2 in the stock market, they're angry about it. We're not talking about $2 in the stock market. We're talking about everything that you had worked for professionally being ripped away from you without legal recourse of any sort. The kinds of things that, quite frankly, would naturally embitter a man or woman. And what does that process look like?
It's a process that can only happen through God. In the flesh, you can't do that. Your flesh wants to fight and get bitter. But we made a conscious decision when everybody gets their own mantle from the Lord to do what they deem is best for them. But for me and my family, we decided that we would travel the forgiveness road. And it rips out any vestiges of your old self in you during that process. So that process was very amazing for me in that it was like heart surgery, where all my old prejudices and all my old man was systematically ripped out through this process of deciding to forgive. You don't wake up one day and feel forgiving. You've got to actually decide and make a conscious effort to do it. Now, I just studied scripture to see what Jesus would say about this, and I thought there should be some loopholes on the forgiveness thing, but there isn't. They're written in big red bold letters in the Bible. Matthew 5 is quite brutal about turn the other cheek, and if the enemy's hungry, feed him, and if your enemy's thirsty, give him something to drink. And my natural thing was saying, but if I make my enemy stronger, if I feed him, I'm making him stronger so he can come back and do more damage to me. But the Lord would say to me and say, no, just do what I say and watch what I do. And so we had to take that literally in every sphere, where it came to even, if a man steals your coat, give him your tunic as well. So in my life, and I'm not talking for anybody else, it's just my life, it was, if a man steals your farm, teach him how to farm. Because Jesus says that kind of thing. So as hard as it is, but once you do that, it just sets the prisoner free. And you realize that you are the one in the prison. You are in a prison of unforgiveness. And I had a way of doing it, which I still have to do today. I get pangs of angst and anger in me because I miss my farm terribly. And I don't condone for a minute what's happened on, but I've made a conscious decision that I'm moving on and not getting bitter about this. And so I had a trigger mechanism that I used to do, where whether a person's stolen your farm or a person has cut you off in the traffic, no matter how big or small the offense is, you take that offense and I leave it at the foot of the cross. Now that issue is between that person and Jesus. It's not between me and him anymore. He doesn't even owe me an apology. And I keep doing that. Whenever I feel the angst or the bitterness coming back, I take that offense, no matter how small it is, I leave it at the foot of the cross. It's between that person and God, and vengeance is mine, said God. He will deal with everybody in their own situations. And so it's not for me to lose sleep over that other person's connection to God. And so I can do that, and it's not easy, but I've managed to do that, and I walk in the peace of getting out of that jail. You know, when you hang on to that angst and bitterness, it's like drinking poison and hoping the other guy's going to die. And so, as unjust and all that it is, my personal story is that I've been given the freedom now. God's put me in another calling, where you said, I once had a farm in Africa. We say now, I once had a farm in Africa, but now Africa is my farm. He's given me much wider horizons than I would ever had in the kingdom perspective.
Well, and what's interesting about that is we're talking about a world for you which once was a wealthy world. As we understand material goods, that's stripped away. And what you're describing today is a far wealthier world, something that you did not know, could not have understood, did not have in your grasp when you had all those other things in your grasp.
That's right. And storing treasures in heaven is no longer just a sermon point. I just feel that losing your earthly wealth the way we did has connected me in a real way to God, which before my possessions got in the way.
Ben, some of your personal narrative is, as you've shared it, fairly graphic. You know, for both of you, having houses burned to the ground after they were looted, having your cattle maimed, having your fields destroyed, your tractors stolen. If it wasn't nailed down, probably if it was nailed down, it was taken. You know, to the point where you shed quite a bit of blood, and you still live in this country. You don't have to. You can go anywhere in the world. You choose to be there. Maybe you can just fill in some of those details in terms of the narrative and what you think you are doing there in Zimbabwe today.
Well, I think, for me, the big thing is to be where God wants you to be. And if you're not where God wants you to be, then things are not going to be very good. And, I kind of often think about old Jonah. He didn't really want to go to Nineveh. And in fact, he decided to go in exactly the opposite direction because it would be a lot easier, surely, to go to Tarshish. And it was a lot further away from those criminals and those bad people and those torturers and all those people that Nineveh was reputed for. So he went in the wrong direction and he ended up at the bottom of the sea, at the bottom of the mountains, with a seaweed over his head in a desperate, dark, horrible situation,
Better to be obedient.
Better to be obedient. And in our case, and I think God doesn't call you out of situations, he calls you into situations. And we were called into the situation in Zimbabwe, and we haven't been called out of the situation in Zimbabwe. And so long as he doesn't call us into another situation, we must stay in the situation that we are in, and Jesus calls us to be salt and light. And salt is there for rotten meat. We all know what happens if you hang up meat that doesn't have salt on it. It goes rotten. We eat a lot of biltong in Zimbabwe, which is dried meat, and you don't put salt on it, it just goes rotten. But you put salt on it, and the meat is preserved, and it's good meat. So we're in a place where there's a lot of salt that's required, and there's a lot of light that's required. And Jesus is the salt and the light, and we are, as his representatives in Zimbabwe, we are able to put that salt and light into situations where the meat is going rotten and where there is lots of darkness.
I think this is a really critical point because all over the world, there's things that change and a certain degree of nostalgia for the way it once was. And I often will talk to families throughout the world who say, well, I'm leaving my home country. I just can't take it anymore. I don't like it. Things have changed. It's deteriorating socially, morally, politically. There's really no Eden that they're going to, but they know what they want to get away from. And again, what you're describing is almost an antidote is the wrong word for it. If you haven't been called out, then you're still called in. I think
Absolutely.
That's a very interesting word.
I used to get really very upset when people left the country because I knew that we were called to be the salt and the light. And the more people that were the salt and the light, then the more chances were of God being able to really move in the nation. And so when Christians decided, no, we're heading off, I used to get really upset. And I used to actually get really angry with them because it's so sad saying goodbye to people who could be making a difference. But I've got to the point now, in fact, some very, very good friends of ours left just before coming here to Singapore. And we saw them off at the airport and we all had tears streaming down our faces because, they were great friends. They will remain great friends. But when people leave, it's not for us to judge their decisions. We just have to be true to the decisions that God puts on our hearts and to be able to do what we can in the situation that we are in. And, we can't do much. It's only God that can do everything, but we can be his instruments. And for the privilege of being his instruments in the situation that we are in is amazing. And, we do a little bit and Craig does a little bit and Brian does a little bit and other people do a little bit. And those little bits all add up, for Christ's kingdom in our country.
You have the unique experience for the last 10 years, certainly, of not only dealing with political and economic crisis, but also monetary crisis. However you are able to make a living, there still is the challenge of operating in the context of aggressive inflation. You've seen one of the worst hyperinflations in modern times. There's also radical deflation. It's basically monetary volatility on an amazing scale. This is one kind of disturbance that you get to experience in your life, along with the economic, social, political, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that I mention in one of the chapters in this book on intentional families is leading your family in such a way that you enable them to deal with disturbance, which is my word for crisis, which is something that takes you out of the status quo. And I'd like for you guys to comment on how, as fathers and as husbands, you have demonstrated leadership to your family. You not only have been through crisis, you continue to go through it. How do you direct that process, that crisis is not something, or disturbance is not something that crushes you, destroys the family unit, takes you out of the game?
I think for me, the greatest thing has been prayer. Going through crisis, if you don't pray as a family, then you're going to find it very, very difficult to deal with the crisis. And, certainly when we were on the farm with very young children and we were having very severe situations take place with people coming around the house at night and beating drums, people breaking into the house at night and pushing us around, people threatening us with guns, and we had some quite difficult situations. And the only thing was to make a family prayer time. Every evening we would sit down with the kids and we would talk to them and we would pray with them and we would ask them what it was that was troubling them and what we should be praying about. And, a lot of people have said, well, it's very actually irresponsible of you to have stayed on going through all that. You should have just left. Your children will be basket cases. They'll be scarred. They'll really suffer. And certainly I've seen traumatized kids. I've seen lots of traumatized kids. But in our situation, and it's only the grace of God, our kids have actually come through it far stronger, I believe, than they would have been if they hadn't gone through it, because they've learned the greatest thing that we can ever give our kids, which is a faith in Jesus Christ, and a living faith in Jesus Christ. I think as a father, I've often thought about this, what is the greatest gift that I can give my children? I've got such a responsibility bringing them up. I need to educate them. I need to make sure that they're looked after from a health point of view. I need to, it's a huge thing bringing a child into the world. But ultimately, the only thing that matters is whether they have got a faith in Jesus Christ, a living faith in Jesus Christ. And I can honestly say that all our three kids have got such a sound, strong faith in Jesus Christ. And, at school, we were such proud parents, Laura and I, this last term, when they had their mid-year exams, and Josh was top of his year of over 70 boys, and Stephen was second in his year of over 70 boys. And you always know a traumatized kid because their handwriting goes to pot, their work goes to pot, their exam results, they're not good. So I just thank God that, first of all, they're not traumatized kids, and secondly, they've got a faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. And I believe that having gone through the crises that we have been through, and having been a praying family through all those times and still a praying family, that has been what has got us through, and that has been what has given those kids the sound faith that they have got today. And, one thing that Laura and I found difficult when we were under severe stress was praying together and reading the Bible together. And we've refound that. And I think that has incredibly strengthened our marriage, because a lot of marriages have taken huge flack through these kind of things that we've all been through. Particularly a woman losing her home, losing her security, losing the garden that she's built up over many years, losing pets that have been killed and things like that. That puts huge, huge stress on relationship. But if you can pray together and read the word together, there is something incredibly powerful and healing in that for a family.
Craig, for you?
Yeah, my family was a lot older when this happened. My son really wanted to farm. He would have been on the farm now. He did 1 year with me before this happened, and he was a good farmer. He would have, my son Sean. But my kids were sort of university age when this happened. I was blessed with a very strong and supportive Christian wife, and my two children, Tracy and Sean, who might not have understood what we were doing, but supported me as a father all the way through it. And when I look at it from their point of view, they've lost an earthly inheritance. So every decision I've made has impacted my whole family. It's not just me. So the strength of the family can get you through things like this. So whilst they've lost their earthly inheritance, I just pray that I've left them a legacy that is not monetary.
And this is the most important legacy you can leave. So there's the issue of disturbance, which we talked about, the effect on your family and the rallying which has occurred, their supportiveness of you and your continued praying together. There is the issue of justice in a world where all of a sudden, what you described, Ben, earlier as the introduction of title deeds and the law courts and the application of the rule of law, these were the things that took a backwater country and made it great overnight. And when you stripped those things away, the loss of the rule of law, the loss of clear title, corruption of the courts, I guess you could say, to some degree, or at least the degradation of the rule of law, everything unraveled. Do you hold on to the idea of there being justice or a day of justice when, in all practical terms, it's not there? There is no recourse, there is no government official to call. I mean, shy of a completely new government and a rolling back of the clocks. How do you view justice and your access to it?
Yeah, I've had a very strong calling to try and do justice in the situation that we are in. And I think we are one body, many parts. And that is a particular calling that I have specifically had with a few others. I used to get a little bit upset that not more people rallied to the cause of justice and trying to create an environment for the future whereby the God-given potential of each human being in Zimbabwe could be realized as a result of justice being in place and fear being banished and all those kinds of things. But I've realized that, we each in the kingdom have specific callings. And that is a specific calling that I and a few other Christians have had. And God has enabled us to do amazing things, I believe, on the justice front, despite the fact that, as you say, the courts are stacked against us, the police force doesn't act, the whole justice system is completely compromised, the laws are dramatically, I believe, against justice and against God's laws and against what's right. And that's why we've seen such a tremendous collapse that has taken place. You can't go against God's laws and expect things to go right in a country. It just doesn't work. It never has. So what we have done on the justice front is used international courts. We've documented stuff that's been going on. We have continued to do whatever we can do on the justice front. And we've supported people that are going through unjust dispossessions as they've happened. We've tried to publicize stuff. We've gone to the SADC Tribunal on 3 occasions, which is the regional court. We've gone to other courts, South African High Court, Supreme Court of Appeal, South African Constitutional Court. We've just gone back again with another case to the South African High Court on the basis that the South African government have acted illegally in dismantling the SADC Tribunal, which was supposed to be there as a court of last resort for 250 million people in Southern Africa. We've been to the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. We've been all sorts of places, to the United States Congress 2 months ago, where I was giving evidence.
What was the response from Congress?
It was actually very good. They responded very well. I really like the way that the American culture is very much an open culture. People like to get to the bottom of things. People like to ask pretty direct questions. And I really valued that. And certainly the chairman of the committee, Chris Smith, was fantastic. And he invited me up to his office afterwards. And it turned out that he was a Christian as well. So, I was very encouraged by their response. They, within 2 weeks, had sent out a delegation from Washington out to Zimbabwe to do some fact finding on the ground. And, I believe that stuff will come out of that. So I was very encouraged by the United States response. But it seems like most countries are just really waiting for events to take their course rather than wanting to influence things too much. Everyone essentially is just waiting for McAlvany to die, and then they think, well, things might change for the better after that. But, we all know that there's no one really in place to take his place that is going to do much better than what he's doing. And so we need, as Christians, I believe, to do what we can to pray godly leaders into place and to do what we can to help potential godly leaders take up their place in the country for a just future within Zimbabwe.
Switching gears to something fairly practical, what is it like day to day to deal with massive amounts of inflation or deflation Maybe you can give us some examples of what it looks like transacting business, doing a job, being paid. What is your experience with these things? Because it's an everyday occurrence.
2008 was when we were peaked on our hyperinflation, and trying to survive in those days for everybody in Zimbabwe was brutal. And so you had probably the poorest people in the country, you'd call them billionaires, because a loaf of bread cost 5 billion at one stage. And money, the printing presses were going flat out, and there was just money being printed at an unprecedented scale. We had notes ranging from 1 cent to $100 trillion notes. And so, because the printing presses couldn't keep up, there wasn't the actual physical money in the banks either. So there were long bank queues, so you couldn't get your money. There was a parallel underground economy of US dollars that was prevailing. And so with prices doubling every 24 hours, we learned new words like sextillion and octillion, and noughts were arbitrarily taken off the currency. 12 zeros would be taken off overnight. We were virtually in a cashless society where we resorted sometimes to barter trade.
Isn't that interesting? At the point where you've got more cash than you can imagine and more zeros than you can imagine, it becomes a cashless society.
You couldn't buy anything. The shops were empty.
We used to have fertilizer bags full of money, just big 50 kg fertilizer bags just full of money to just try and pay our workers. And then eventually we realized, they go to the shops, the prices have already doubled by the time they've got to the shop after, the journey from the farm to the shop. And they couldn't buy what they needed for the month. So we then talked to them and they talked to us, and, eventually came up with plans where we would try and buy stuff for them and get enough groceries for the month and get enough soap and bare essentials so that everyone would be able to survive, but it was crazy. We used to, and just counting out money just took forever. Eventually, you ended up weighing money instead of counting because it would just take too long.
I remember seeing supermarket trolleys just overflowing with money as the supermarket teller would be taking it to the bank, and he would just push it down the street and nobody would bother him at all because the trolley was worth more than the money inside it. It was literally just worthless, and the faster they printed it, the more worthless it became. We used to joke that a $2 million note was worth less than 2 squares of toilet paper.
Or could be used for said toilet paper.
Yes.
So what is the availability of dollars in that environment? You have that as an alternative.
It was illegal. You weren't allowed to use US dollars, so it was illegal.
It's a black market.
There was a black market. We used to go out the country to buy our groceries. But it was a black market and was used as a tool to arrest people and stuff if you were found with US dollars. So there was this parallel underground market going on all the time. That was the only tool really for survival.
Because what happened eventually was the government tried to stop inflation from taking place, but you can't stop inflation from taking place when you're printing billions of dollars all the time, So anyway, they put price controls on all these different commodities. And then if shopkeepers raised their prices above the price control price, they would be put in jail. So what happened was overnight, all the supermarkets and everything just emptied because there was no way that you could sell a product at the price control price and be able to make a profit as a shopkeeper. So they didn't replace any of their stock, and overnight the shops just emptied. There was nothing in the shops. I remember one month they arrested about 4,000 shopkeepers, put them in jail because they were selling them above the price control price. So everything just went black market underground. That was the only way that you could get anything at all. But, it was always a risk. If the police came and searched your house and found US dollars, then you'd be put in jail.
Overnight, for a month, a year?
Well, it was normally for a night, but the jails are pretty horrible. Literally, you're lying on the floor, on the concrete. You've got one blanket between 3 people. Very often, it's so full that you can only turn when everyone else turns.
That sounds like you've been there before.
I've been arrested a number of times, but I've never actually been in overnight. But lots of our friends have been in many times overnight and many times for a lot longer than overnight as well.
You mentioned the other day that you're having bouts of deflation now.
Yeah, we're told by our economists that we're actually in deflation, and that's just a sure sign that there's no production happening in the country. I don't understand the economics of it, but that's what I've been led to understand, that means you go into deflation when your economy is no longer growing.
And so what is the experience of transacting business today? It's not like it was in 2008.
No, it's nothing like that. The shops are full of stuff, but unemployment's rising. And I think we're staring down the barrel of another economic problem coming our way, because there's just no production in the country. And you've got these massive workforces that are all being unproductive, and they're not allowed to be retrenched. So the working person is in trouble. We're all in trouble, but I don't know how it's going to play out. But economically, our shops are full. And if you came to Zimbabwe now, you wouldn't think there was any problem at all. But salaries are shrinking, unemployment's rising. And in a country that's not generating any foreign direct investment, something's got to break.
Yeah, most families end up in a situation where they're getting remittances from other family members who are working in South Africa or working in the UK, or that keeps them going. But we're running 85% unemployment plus at the moment.
85%.
Yeah, so there's only 15% of the workforce that's actually employed.
They're the only taxpayers, obviously.
Seems like it's ripe for revolution. 85% unemployment, that's a lot of people to complain and blame and cause mischief.
Well, the trouble is there is such a huge level of fear in the country, and everyone knows what happens to you if you do decide to cause a demonstration or whatever. The last guy that went to a rally with 20,000 people and said that he was going to lead the people to Unity Square in a march, a peaceful march, disappeared. He vanished into thin air, and he's never been seen since. That was back in March. It's Zamara. So everyone knows what happens to you if you decide to lead some form of protest. You disappear, you get killed, you get beaten, you get put in jail. So fear is the biggest problem that everyone faces. No one wants to disappear particularly.
Right. Fear is an interesting thing. I remember sitting in our dining room when I was a younger man, and my mom served pot roast. We had a guest from out of town. Occasionally my dad would just show up and there would be the guest. My mom would say, well, could have called. In this case, he did call, and she had time to put something on for dinner. And we got halfway through the dinner, and it didn't seem like our guest was eating much. So my mom, sort of in her hospitable way, was, is there anything else I can bring you? You feeling okay? And his response was, I'm a vegetarian by choice. I was a part of Mugabe's regime early on, and part of our tactics were to go into the village and kill and eat the leader. And when I became a Christian, I just had a hard time eating meat since then. And the idea of fear can be so extreme. I mean, in this case, where you're forced to watch your father, your grandfather be just eaten, you can be overwhelmed by fear. Living in a country where you don't exactly have security, you don't have the protection of the rule of law. There's a whole host of reasons for you to exist with fear. Again, I'd bring it back to your men, your fathers, your husbands. What is it that you do to create a sense of calm when naturally there could be a fear that permeates everything that you do?
Fear is obviously the petrol of dictators. The dictators cannot continue without fear being a prominent part or the most important part of their strategy. And so long as a population is cowed by fear, then they will remain in place, essentially. But it's important for us as Christians not to allow fear to rule us and rule our lives. The command in the Bible not to fear comes up more times than any other command throughout the book, apart from the command to love. And I'm really interested in that because Jesus talks about love casting out fear. So these two greatest commands, or these two most oft-repeated commands, first of all, the command to love, and secondly, the command not to fear, are linked by Jesus. And perfect love casts out fear. So if we understand that we are perfectly loved, and we understand that we are the children of the living God, the one who threw the stars into space, the one who created each one of us fearfully and wonderfully, then suddenly what is there to fear of man? Because we have this amazing God. We've got a big God. We've got a God bigger than we can even ever possibly imagine. And so I think that is where we need to get to the point where we understand just a little bit more about how amazing this God is that we serve. Because he can take us out of situations, and we know that his promises are true, and he will never allow us to go through more than what we can resist. You know, he will give us the strength in whatever situation that we face. So what is there to fear then when we know that, and we know that his promises are true? And for some, the faith starts to waver at that stage. But because we've been through situations where we've seen God come through, we can look back at those situations and we can say, well, God, you were there at that time, and you were there at that time, and you were there at that time, and you're going to be there this time in the future as well. And that's an amazing privilege to know and to have the faith that we are able to overcome whatever fears might come our way as a result of the threats that Satan likes to throw out at us.
You know, Satan rules by fear, and the only antidote to that is the Lord Jesus and his love, which casts out fear. So for me, it's to go in the opposite spirit of what Jesus would do, and that casts out fear. So for me, my future hope and prayer for Zimbabwe is complete and utter reconciliation. And that's my path, is to, no matter what anybody does to me, I'm not going to allow the actions of someone else to determine how I live my life. My mission is reconciliation to all, to whoever, and with the love of Jesus, going as he would have gone in the opposite spirit. And that love is what breaks down fear.
Gentlemen, thanks for taking the time to share a bit of your history, your home country's history, your encounter with evil and your response to it. In the last few days, there's many people who have been able to learn from the strength of choices that you've made. Know that will serve us in our lives well in many ways and in many years to come. So thank you for your transparency and your willingness to travel and be here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dave.
Well, for me, it's a mind bender to think of going from having a farm in Africa to farming Africa and enabling others to do that. That's a disposition which I can't fully conceive of. Perhaps I can imagine, but there is a redemptive theme in that. It is clear that you're talking about individual choices that someone has to make to manage their own rage, to manage their own sense of injustice, and to move towards forgiveness. Does that seem insane in our modern world? Perhaps it does, but I've seen people who've been destroyed by cancer and a loss of health simply because they allowed bitterness to destroy them when something did not go right in their lives. One of the themes that I develop in my book is the issue of disturbance. We all experience disturbance of some sort.
No one is exempt. No one is exempt.
That can be the death of a loved one. That can be marital infidelity. That can be the loss of a job. That can be implosion of any variety. And do you know what you have? You have a response that occurs, and it is either driven towards redemption and cohesion,
or bitterness.
Or bitterness and destruction.
Well, and you know, for the person who wants to read the story of Ben Freeth, the book is Mugabe and the White African. And this gives his story. In fact, there's color pictures inside of just some of the destruction and some of the background of what actually went on there at the turn of the millennium.
Managing resources is far more complex than looking at a balance sheet and saying, here's the assets that we're dealing with. The reality is you develop a broader set of assets over time as you mature as an individual, and you develop things such as courage, such as virtue, such as trustworthiness, such as the ability to forgive. And these end up being valuable assets that you draw on at different points in your life.
So you can lose the farm, but you can still continue to farm by having what's inside of you cultivated.
Absolutely. And I think ultimately the issue of legacy, for me, ties to how well have you managed all of your resources, not particularly limiting it to the issue of financial resources. So this, to me, I think was an interesting conversation with both Craig and Ben to capture what it looks like to deal with crisis. Crisis takes a variety of forms. It's not always a collapse of a society like you have in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe, but here you have not only operating on a black market and living in context of hyperinflation and having all of your financial resources ripped out from underneath
Confiscation,
you. But how do you live as an individual, not just from the standpoint of resources, but how do you wake up the next morning and not just want to go insane? I think this was an interesting exploration. I'm grateful for them spending the time with us.
You've been listening to the McAlvany Weekly Commentary. I'm Kevin Orrick, along with David McAlvany and our guests today, Ben Freeth and Craig Deal. You can find us at McAlvany.com. That's McAlvany, or give us a call at 800-525-9556.
This has been the McAlvany Weekly Commentary. The views expressed should not be considered to be a solicitation or a recommendation for your investment portfolio. You should consult a professional financial advisor to assess your suitability for risk and investment. Join us again next week for a new edition of the McAlvany Weekly Commentary.